Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole McNeely, filling in for Cole Lauterbach. Coming up on this Washington in Focus, Vancouver, Washington improves regulations on short-term rentals. Workers' compensation premiums are rising in 2024, and we'll take a look at some of the new laws taking effect in the new year in the state of Washington. All that and more on this episode of Washington in Focus. I'm Cole McNeely. Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate. Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole McNeely. Washington in Focus is a production of America's Talking Network and features stories from journalists from the Center Square. Check out all the stories we talk about today at thecentersquare.com. Again, we're going to be covering Vancouver, Washington, approving regulations on short-term rentals, worker compensation premiums in 2024, and all the new laws that are going into effect. We'll hear about those two later, but right now we're starting with Spencer Pauly, the Center Square's reporter out of Seattle, Washington. Spencer, you put out a story this week at thecentersquare.com talking about Vancouver, Washington, not a Seattle story. So I'm sorry if I misled the viewers and all the good people at home that thought they were going to get a Seattle story here. We're in Vancouver. They approved new regulations on short-term rentals. And Spencer, these short-term rentals, when we talk about that, what are these? We know what they are, but we may not hear or think about them as, quote, short-term rentals.
Yeah, most people would think about these as Airbnbs, which this newly passed ordinance tackles, basically. So operators of short-term rentals or Airbnbs will now be required to obtain a business license and a permit. Now, the business license will cost about $50, and the one-time permit costs $250. Mainly, the city passed this because its goal is to limit the number of these Airbnbs to no more than 870 units. That seems like a lot, but this is equal to about 1% of Vancouver's housing stock. It seems like Vancouver is having an issue where more Airbnbs are just throughout the community. You have to understand that Vancouver is just across the Columbia River, bordering Portland, Oregon. So that is a destination city, basically. And a lot of people find cheaper Airbnbs across the way. And so you're seeing a lot of, property owners in Vancouver just basically making a bigger buck, I suppose, off of putting their property on Airbnb and letting people stay there. So it seems like the city is just trying to limit this so it doesn't get out of hand.
And Portland, you mentioned Portland there. I know Portland has been, I would say, a leading city in terms of in the country itself, beyond just the West Coast, on kind of taking aim at the greater gig economy, as they call it, of Uber and Lyft and things like that, ride sharing services in general. And we're kind of seeing some of these regulations spill over into short-term housing rentals. Spencer, so you kind of mentioned why they want to kind of cap these short-term rentals at a certain number, but why that number? Is this an arbitrary number, or is there some societal benefit as they see in terms of putting these regulations in by kind of capping these short-term rental numbers?
Well, the city conducted a study prior to this legislation to see, what should be the cap. And basically they found there are 425 non-permitted Airbnbs in the city. Now, these can range from 1 unit to 4 to 5 units. These can be bigger homes. And so the median nightly rental rate is about $118 in Vancouver. Pretty cheap compared to a big city like, Portland, or if you go all the way up to Seattle in a 2-hour drive. The city is just dealing with more Airbnbs because of this. Housing advocates feel that these Airbnbs just pose a real threat by removing housing stock from the market. And then the hotel and tourism industry in that area also feel that Airbnb should just be required to have the same inspections and regulations as hotels. Also, advocates feel that too many Airbnbs can just impact the community as well. It can make it seem more plastic, generic, and, lose the authenticity of these neighborhoods in Vancouver that have been around for so many years.
Yeah, and certainly I know in the country in general, and I assume this is true in the state of Washington, but looking at numbers, I would almost guarantee it. There is a housing shortage in general, and I know a lot of critics of short-term rentals point to those as basically things that are furthering the problems that come along with housing shortages, people not being able to have homes, people on street corners, things like that. And certainly that's an issue right there you talked about in Portland, certainly an issue in Portland. And kind of, looking at the larger problem there. Spencer, I think what's kind of interesting, you brought up a secondary point there about level playing field for the marketplace. I mean, this has been beyond Airbnb. I know I'll take it back to the greater gig economy, Uber, things like that. That was a large criticism when they came into the marketplace as well, which is you're acting like a taxi cab, you're looking like a taxi cab, but you're not being regulated like you're a taxi cab. And is this the same sort of thing you're hearing from those in the kind of what we'd call the traditional tourism industry, the hotel owners or advocacy groups on that side? Is that, not inherently an issue, but if they're going to be acting like a hotel, looking like a hotel, they should be playing by the same rules as a hotel.
Absolutely. And especially because you're taking revenue away from these hotels. If more people go through the Airbnbs, hotels are going to eventually go out of business. Then you're going to have a whole other issue on your hand in the city of Vancouver, where, more people are just going to have to turn to Airbnbs, and more people are going to be in these neighborhoods where they're not neighbors. I think another thing you should also think about is the city of Vancouver, just outside Portland, which has a huge homelessness issue, trying to build affordable housing. We need more affordable housing, more units for people who are homeless, supplemental housing, what have you. When you have so much Airbnbs, that takes away from that in some capacity. That land could be purchased by the city and transitioned over to something that's more beneficial to, solve an issue. The Vancouver recently, 2 months ago, I believe, declared a state of emergency because of the homelessness issue they are having there. And so you have to think about that as well.
Well, and if they go, Spencer, if they go in too, and you've got people that go in and kind of renovate these houses, make them nice for short-term rentals, well, that's going to raise your property value, which in turns raises your property taxes, which in turns make it a higher cost of living to live in that area.
Absolutely.
And again, there's all that side of it. And obviously the other side of that argument is, well, people should be free to do what they want. And that's, I think, a compelling case to a lot of people. Now, Spencer, I thought one of the interesting things you mentioned there, you kind of mentioned a cultural aspect of this, that Airbnbs going into places impacts the culture of the place because it turns it into kind of this tourist destination, maybe more so. Come in, stay for a night or two, enjoy your experience versus making it feel like home. Is that a real problem that people see, or is that more of a speculative problem, I guess I'll say?
That's perhaps more of a speculative problem, but I think one thing to be recognized is that it is cheaper to stay at an Airbnb in Vancouver and then just travel across the river over to Portland, which is where more people go. That's where they get more traffic. So I don't think it quite helps Vancouver when you lose your community, your population, and it just goes for people who are just going to go over to Portland and spend their money there. I think that's one thing that should be taken into account there. Now, I will say that there was opposition to this regulation that was in place because a lot of these Airbnb hosts just say that this provides supplemental income to them. It helps with their monthly expenses. Cost of living in Washington and in Vancouver is high. And so this supplemental income helps with, medical bills, rent, things like that. And that's kind of the advocacy you see there.
Well, and then there becomes an entire economy around short-term rentals too, right? I mean, this is kind of the thing with disruption in markets is that then you have people that do house cleaning, right? That, have a whole business built around that. So, certainly not super black and white. There is some gray in this entire discussion. We're talking with Spencer Pauly here, Center Square's reporter, about Vancouver, Washington, improving regulations on short-term rentals on the Washington in Focus here. So, Spencer, one last question. We'll get you out of here. This happened in Vancouver. Is this being seen to be happening elsewhere in the state of Washington, or do we think this is going to stop and stay in Vancouver because it is right there next to Portland?
I can't say I have seen any other ordinances proposed in the same kind of landscape here, but I think we could see it in the future here, especially neighboring cities outside of Seattle. We might see more Airbnbs in Bellevue or Redmond and like some of the nicer, smaller cities. They might be seeing an issue with this as well. So that will be something to keep an eye on in the future.
Gotcha. Well, hey, keep up with that story and more at centersquare.com. Spencer Pauly, thanks for joining us today on Washington in Focus. Hey, and now we're going to head over to our other Center Square reporter that joins us each week, or one of a couple of them. It's Randy Brock. And Randy, he put out a story this week about a slew of legislation that's going to take into effect at the new year. We're on the doorstep of 2024. And Randy, we've got more than 24 new laws and regulations that are going to take effect January 1st in the state, including an increase in the state's minimum wage, a 10-day waiting period, and even safety training requirements for firearm purchases, rules regarding employment of persons using cannabis or marijuana outside the workplace. Randy, let's run through these as best we can, given the fact there are a lot of them.
Yeah, these new statutes are among scores of bills that were approved by state legislators earlier this year, and they were signed into law by Governor Jay Inslee. Most of the measures that were enacted went into place in July. There's a handful of them that are on hold until 2025, but there are this 24 or so that are coming up.
Well, and now to summarize some of those, on tap for 2024, let's start with the state's new minimum wage increase.
Okay. As of January 1, Washington State will now have the dubious distinction of having the nation's highest minimum wage when the current rate, $15.74 an hour, jumps up by 3.4% to $16.28 per hour. That's more than double the federal minimum wage of $7.25, which has remained unchanged since July of 2009. The state's new rate's going to be even higher in a couple cities. Seattle is going to go up to $18.69, and the community of SeaTac is going to be over $19.06 an hour, according to the Washington Department of Labor and Industries. And this is going to apply to most agriculture and non-ag jobs that qualify for minimum wage. They do allow a lower rate for if you're going to use minors ages 14 or 15, but they still got to receive at least 85% of the minimum wage. And there's also a little bit lower rate for certain on-the-job apprentice workers, maybe disabled workers and student workers. These annual adjustments are based on the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index, and that's based on urban wage earners and clerical workers. And all of this results from an Initiative 433, that was approved by Washington voters back in 2016.
In recent years here, restrictions on firearms in the state of Washington have gotten a lot of attention because you've got Governor Jay Inslee, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, and a democratically controlled legislature that have been pushing these things. What's the latest when it comes to restrictions on firearms in the state of Washington here, Randy?
So what's new now is a waiting period on firearm purchases and firearm transfers. With the legislature passing House Bill 1143, licensed dealers may not transfer any firearm until completion of federal and state background checks regarding the purchaser's eligibility to even possess a firearm. For that to occur, there's now got to be a waiting period of 10 business days from when the dealer requests the background check. So a gun buyer or recipient of a firearm must also provide proof of completing a recognized firearm safety training program within the last 5 years. And this has to include safety training for semi-automatic rifles, aka assault rifles, and instruction on state laws regarding use of deadly force in self-defense, techniques on avoiding criminal attacks, and this is a quote, management of violent confrontations. So you're supposed to get some training in those regards if you're going to be getting a new firearm. There are some exemptions for law enforcement officers and military personnel who have received firearm trainings.
So, Randy, testing employees for the use of marijuana or cannabis products, that's a new thing going into effect. Under federal and state laws, cannabis remains a controlled substance, so it's subject to criminal penalties, even though Washington has allowed medical use of it for patients since 1998 and legal recreational use since 2012. The contradictions are compounded by state and federal laws, which allow employers, contractors, and grant recipients in Washington to establish drug-free workplace policies, including drug and alcohol testing. So what's new now?
There's a Senate Bill 5123, and under that, employers are now prohibited from discriminating against a prospective employee based on that person's use of cannabis off the job and away from the workplace. And employers can't require drug screening tests which identify traces of cannabis in a person's system. So in other words, you can drug test a potential hiree, but you can't test them for marijuana or cannabis. However, the new legislation does not prohibit an employer from making hiring decisions based on drug screening for other substances beyond cannabis or marijuana. And it can require testing of an employee if they're involved in an accident and they're suspected of being impaired or under the influence of not only maybe cannabis, but alcohol, other controlled substances or medications. And also, the law it still maintains the right of a workplace free of drugs and alcohol or any other obligation required by federal law or regulation. The new bill does not apply to applicants who are seeking employment with law enforcement agencies, police departments, jails, fire departments, EMTs, 911 dispatchers, positions in the airline or aerospace industries, or other safety-sensitive jobs where impairment could pose a substantial risk of death.
Well, speaking of a substantial risk of death or injury, street racing has been popularized by Hollywood for decades. I mean, we have movies like American Graffiti and Vin Diesel's Fast and Furious franchise that I think they're on episode or film 35 now. They're seeing if they can triple the amount of Fast and Furious as Stallone did with Rocky. But, street racing has become very popular over the years. It's been kind of a part of this Hollywood Americana of sorts. When it's on the ground in real life, it's a little different, and apparently that's caught the attention of lawmakers in Olympia.
Apparently so. Earlier this year, they passed another bill, Senate Bill 5606, and that looks to deter and further penalize illegal street racing after law enforcement agencies, police in Washington reported an increasing number of sometimes some violent outbreaks or deadly events in recent years. So under the new law, street racing has been defined as, quote, willfully comparing or contesting the relative speeds of motor vehicles on public roadways or unauthorized off-street locations, even if these vehicles don't exceed the maximum speed limit. So comparing or contesting your Honda, whatever, Civic against some other tuner car, that's a thing now, even if you're still under the posted speed limit. This sort of racing is considered reckless driving, and that's a gross misdemeanor. You could be fined up to $5,000 and spend a year in jail. Police, if they make an arrest in this regard, they have the discretion to impound and tow away the offending vehicles. And if those vehicles aren't claimed by their owners after being notified by the State Department of Licensing, these rigs can be sold at public auction. Any proceeds that they raise can go back to the police agency within its jurisdiction to improve general traffic safety. This is the way the new law reads.
All right. So, Randy, you're going to have to stop doing your street racing, I guess, my friend.
I guess so. My old Dodge, it's not going to make it anymore. So it's a Dodge minivan. It's not something you street race. So.
All right. Well, that's a shame. So, all right. Well, hey, we'll keep up with that. There is a litany of other laws going into place in 2024. If you're interested in that, folks, Randy has put out some great stories, and the entire Center Square team at thecentersquare.com. Randy, thanks very much for joining us on Washington in Focus today. Now it's to the Center Square's big man on the proverbial Washington campus. You know him, you love him. It's the Center Square's Washington editor, Brett Davis. Brett, how you doing?
All right. Thank you for that too kind introduction.
Well, I want to make you feel good. It's the holidays. It's
That's
Christmas season, and I get to spend it with you. And for those who don't know, Brett sports a very nice beard, and it's a little bit like I'm talking to Washington's own Santa Claus. I mean, it's nice. I feel nice. And you got any hot cocoa over there?
It's a bit
that,
shaggy right now, but I did get a new razor for Christmas, so I'll be breaking that in shortly.
Oh boy, man, that's hey. For the folks at home listening to this on podcast or radio, man, you'll have to look up Brett's picture on the Center Square's website in 2024 to see if he's shaved. So, hey, Brett, we have real business to discuss here. Kind of hopping off of what we were talking about with Randy. A lot of new changes coming in January 2024.
Right.
One of the ones you wrote about in particular was in the state of Washington. A workers' compensation premium rate is going up an average of nearly 5%. It's at 4.9% on January 1st. So let's start with what exactly is workers' compensation, and then why is it going up?
So according to the Washington State Department of Labor and Industries, employers and workers, they pay into a system to help cover the cost of providing wage and disability benefits for injured workers, as well as medical treatment for workplace injuries and illnesses. So that's where the money goes to, what it goes for.
All right. So then how does that actually kind of translate from a practical standpoint in terms of cost?
So that translates into an average annual increase of about $65 in workers' comp premiums to be shared by employers and employees. So workers pay about a quarter of the premium. So employers pay about 75%. So it's a 75-25% split.
So why the average rate hike? Why the hike in general?
Right. Well, L&I looks at several factors every year when determining any possible rate increases. They look at things like expected workers' comp payouts, the size of its emergency reserve, wage inflation, and the like. Healthcare costs, they're going up, as are wages, and that, of course, means it costs more to help workers when they get hurt. L&I put a little bit of a positive spin on things, and they noted that this is the fourth consecutive year in which the rate increase is less than 5% because they're using their workers' comp reserve to lessen the impact.
And I saw, Brett, because you're a great journalist, you reached out to the officials at the National Federation of Independent Business for their take and got different opinions on the impact of this rate and what it could really do to consumers on that side of this equation. We talked about employees, we talked about employers, but we didn't talk about consumers.
Right. So Patrick Connor, he's the director of NFIB in Washington. He said he believes consumers will feel what he called a domino effect. He said per L&I's estimates, the state-run workers' comp system already averages about $1,300 per employee. A 5% or nearly 5% rate hike would translate into a small business with 10 employees will be hit with a $650 bigger bill in 2024. Small businesses, he said, will be forced to increase prices just to stay afloat amid the workers' comp increase and a flood of other government-mandated costs, some of which you talked about earlier, including the state's minimum wage and overtime exempt salary increases. I talked to somebody else at NFIB. That would be Anthony Melandra. He's the senior media manager at NFIB, and he cited a more than 20-year-old study done by the organization that indicates that maybe a lot of small businesses will just end up absorbing the hit. They did a survey way back in 2001 that basically noted that a lot of small business owners will respond by absorbing the increased costs in the form of lower earnings or profits, higher selling prices, and reductions in the use of the good or service whose cost rose. Think things like conserving energy when energy costs rise. He noted that employee-related measures, we're talking about layoffs here, are not taken often unless they are the good or service itself where the cost is going up. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Lots of effects going into 2024 here in the state of Washington.
That's
Brett
right.
Davis, the Center Square's Washington editor. Thanks for joining us today on Washington in Focus. For those listening at home, you can check out all these stories and more at thecentersquare.com. Click the states, go down to Washington, click on that. You'll see Randy, Brett, Spencer stories across the board. So check us out at thecentersquare.com. Fellas, thanks for joining me today. And for all you listening at home, thanks for listening to Washington in Focus. Hope you had a happy holiday season here, Christmas or whatever you celebrate. And then a very happy new year despite all the all these laws going into effect. And, Randy and Brett were kind of the bearers of bad news going into the new year here of increased cost. And it felt that way, Brett. So anyway, that's the nature of the world. But check out all these stories and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole McNeely. Thanks for listening to Washington in Focus. We'll be back next week.